This is the headstone of Amasa Sawyer Tracy, a U.S. Civil War veteran and Medal of Honor recipient who died in 1908, 117 years ago. And this is the headstone of Daniel Chipman, a former lawyer and United States congressman who died in 1850, 175 years ago. And this is the headstone of Amenhotep, a mummified Egyptian child who died in 1883 BC, over 3,900 years ago. All three of these gravestones are in the same cemetery in Middlebury, Vermont. How and why is there a nearly 4,000-year-old Egyptian mummy buried in the hills of rural New England alongside rows and rows of graves that aren't even 400 years old? Well, let's find out. All right, so like with many of the landmarks that we talk about on this channel, the story of Vermont's Egyptian mummy is heavily intertwined with folklore and legend, to a point where sometimes it can be hard to separate out the fact from the fable. So what I'm gonna do is tell you just the skeleton of the story first, like the basic narrative that I'm pretty confident is genuinely the truth, and then later we'll circle back and add in some of the juicier details that I'm not quite so sure about. So let's get started. Now, the fun thing about this story is that all three of the main characters are actually buried in this very same cemetery. You've already met Amenhotep, the mummy whose mysterious burial we are here to investigate, but the story actually starts just a little ways away at another headstone. This is the Sheldon family stone, which lists the names of several generations of Sheldons who lived and died here in Middlebury, Vermont. The last name on the list is Henry Sheldon, a very important figure in our story. And at first glance, Henry seems like a pretty normal guy. He was born in 1821 and spent most of his life in Middlebury. He worked at the post office, he got involved in real estate, he served as the town clerk, he ran a restaurant for a while. Nothing really all that out of the ordinary for a man in 19th century Vermont, right? But behind Henry's conventional pursuits and interests was something else. Above all, Henry Sheldon was intensely fascinated with history and antiquities. Starting in the 1870s, he began to attend every estate sale he could. He traveled all around the county buying up anything and everything that caught his eye. And so, before long, Henry had amassed an absolutely huge collection of coins and furniture and books and all sorts of objects and antiques that he felt should be preserved and celebrated. Many people criticized Sheldon's collections as junk and trash, but to him, they were treasures. And so, in 1884, he opened up the Henry Sheldon Museum in downtown Middlebury, which is still in operation to this day. Although it's actually closed for the next few months, so unfortunately, I can't show you the inside. And from here, I'm sure you can guess where the story is about to go next. Soon after opening his museum, Henry Sheldon decided that he wanted an Egyptian mummy, because according to him, every museum should have a mummy. And so, in 1886, Henry Sheldon bought himself a mummy through the mail from a dealer in New York City. The problem with ordering a mail-order mummy, though, is you don't actually get to see what you're buying until it arrives. And sure enough, as soon as that package made its way up to Middlebury, Henry learned that his brand new Egyptian mummy was in terrible condition. Quite the disappointment, I'm sure. Because the mummy was in such poor condition, Henry only put it on display for a short time before eventually deciding to place the mummy in storage in the museum attic. And after the mummy went into the attic, it stayed there for years, That little mummy sat up in the attic and waited as Henry Sheldon died in 1907, as new management took over the museum, as the decades passed and passed and passed, until finally in 1945, the mummy was rediscovered by museum staff. And this time it was in really bad condition. Years and years of freezing winters and roasting summers had dissolved the resins holding the mummy together to a point where the whole thing was just starting to disintegrate. And so the initial proposal from the museum was to just throw the mummy away, take it down to the town dump, and get rid of it for good. But before that could happen, our third and final main character stepped into the story. This is the headstone of George Walcott Mead, the director of the Henry Sheldon Museum in 1945 when the mummy was first discovered in the attic. Reportedly, Mead was not on board with the plan to just throw the mummy away. Instead, he had quite a different idea for dealing with the problem. See, George Mead was a gentleman of the old school who believed in the fundamental decencies granted to all human beings. No human remains, regardless of how old or how small, deserve to just be thrown into the trash. And so, George Mead placed the mummy in a metal tray created by the local blacksmith. He cremated the body in the furnace of an apartment building in Middlebury, and he had the ashes of the Middlebury mummy buried right here in the Middlebury Cemetery. Legally, George was supposed to have obtained a death certificate before he could bury anybody in the cemetery, but apparently the local law enforcement just kind of looked the other way and let the little mummy be laid to rest. And that is the basic story of the Middlebury mummy. Almost definitely, those are the facts. But like I said earlier, there is quite a bit of extra information in this story that may or may not be true. So what I want to do now is go back through and fill in some of the juicier details of the story that aren't quite so set in stone. And just to start us off, I'd like to demonstrate just how off the rails some of the narratives about this stone have gotten over the years. Like, take a look at this newspaper from 1959 that apparently thinks that the mummy was a fully grown adult, because just look at that picture that they used in the article. Or how about this Canadian newspaper from 1953 that gets the birth date of the mummy wrong by 700 years and doesn't even bother to print the actual name on the stone. They just say that the mummy's name is long and unpronounceable. But even mistakes like that are small potatoes compared to some of the completely crazy stories that some of these newspapers made up. Like, check this out. Here is a paper from Providence, Rhode Island with a totally different narrative than the one that I just told you. According to this paper, the mummy was not found by George Mead and his staff, but instead by an anonymous lady who inherited the museum. The lady felt a missionary ardor to save the mummy's soul, so she baptized the mummy and then buried it here in the cemetery. So totally different than the real story, right? The extra funny thing about this one is that the author of the article says that they were assured by more than one person that these details are true. But that is an extreme example. Now, let's take a look at some of the more plausible details, starting with the name of the mummy. Because I'm sure by now, some of you might be wondering how George Mead knew what to put on the headstone, right? Well, depending on what you read, it's because either the wrappings of the mummy or the board that the mummy was laying on had some inscriptions on them with information on the mummy's origin. George Mead had these inscriptions translated in New York, and that is how he learned the name of the mummy, the year the mummy was born, and most critically, that this little mummy was actually a prince. You see, Thom Wyatt, the mummy's father, was actually an Egyptian pharaoh, which makes our little mummy royalty. Or at least, maybe. See, the reason that I didn't include all this stuff in my factual recounting of the story is because there's actually a lot of disagreement on whether or not the information that George Meade had translated was correct or not. Royal Egyptian genealogy is like way outside of my wheelhouse, so I can't pretend to tell you for sure if Amun-Her is really an Egyptian prince or not, but I can tell you that there is definitely skepticism around that idea. Some modern Egyptologists do not fully buy that Amun-Her is a prince, mostly because there's no hard proof that the Egyptians even made child mummies during the time that Thom Wyatt was pharaoh. Plus, as far as I can tell, there's no actual record besides this mummy that Amun-Her's supposed mother and father were even actually married, let alone that they had a child with this particular name. So the idea that this is the burial site of an Egyptian prince is unconfirmed at the very least. And to be honest, the skepticism kind of makes sense to me on an intuitive level too. Like, this is just completely my own opinion, but at the time that Sheldon made his purchase, mummies were like super hot commodities for museums and collectors. So it would not be all that surprising to me if the information about this mummy being a prince was just like made up by some antique dealer because they knew that they could get a higher price for a mummy prince than just a random unidentified mummy. Plus, those inscriptions that George Meade found on the mummy were apparently in Spanish too. So it wasn't even like original Egyptian writing. And you know, while we're talking about the Spanish inscriptions, I should mention that a lot of sources include very elaborate backstories that go way beyond just the lineage of the mummy. Like, we get all sorts of specific information about how the mummy was stolen from its tomb in exactly 1850 by Arab grave robbers, and that it was eventually routed through Cairo via some Spanish traders, which is where the inscriptions came from, and then the mummy made its way through Europe before it eventually landed in New York City and then Middlebury, Vermont. Which could very well all be true as far as I know. It's just I have not been able to find any information on where all that detail is supposed to have come from. So I really do not feel comfortable presenting it to you as fact when I don't even know where that story originally came from. Like, it could be true, but again, it could also just be something that an antique dealer told Henry Sheldon to try to make the mummy seem more interesting. And just also, some of the details that people put into these accounts of the mummy's history are just so specific, I have a hard time believing that they didn't just completely make them up. Like, look at this paper in 1965 that says that Amun-Her was born a beautiful but sickly child. Like, how on earth could you possibly know that? I have found zero info on Amun-Her's cause of death. Like, for all we know, he died in some kind of accident or something. So this is just a complete and total assumption on the part of the journalist. But hey, it's not just the origin of the mummy where we run into some interesting, unconfirmed detail. The story of George Meade burying the mummy also occasionally includes some pretty interesting little tidbits. Like, for example, some people say that there was a leak in the attic of the museum, and that's why the mummy got ruined. And some people say that the mummy actually was sent down to the town dump by the museum staff, and George Meade literally ran down to the dump and dug the mummy out of the trash heaps personally. And some people say that the reason that George decided to have the mummy cremated was because he was worried that local kids and pranksters might dig up the body if he left it as an intact mummy. But all that kind of speculative stuff aside, there actually is one more pretty major detail in this story that I have not told you about yet. See, I've actually kind of been keeping a secret from you. A pretty big secret that I think is perfect for closing out this video. Something that some of you might have already figured out on your own. Let's take another look at the mummy's headstone up close, and you might see what I mean. Let me ask you, does this really look like a gravestone that was put up 80 years ago in 1945? Not really, right? Well, that's because this is actually a replacement stone. The original headstone that George Meade erected in 1945 was pretty badly damaged a few years ago, and so this headstone was put up in its place. Luckily, there's actually tons of old photos and drawings of what the original stone used to look like, but before I show you those images, I want to tell you about a quandary that George Meade found himself in when he decided to bury Amun-Her. According to a report that George wrote on the incident, he wanted to put an Egyptian symbol of life on the gravestone, but he was worried if that would be okay to do in a Christian cemetery, which this was back in 1945. And so, George got around the problem by burying Amun-Her under a stone with both a Christian cross and the Egyptian symbol of life. There are a ton of fantastic old pictures of this stone. It was a local attraction for decades and decades before it was destroyed. I even found a bunch of pictures of people posing with the stone. Pretty cool, right? But out of all of these pictures, my very favorite is one that I found in an old issue of Ford Times magazine from 1950. In this magazine is an article about the Middlebury mummy that includes a full color picture of George Meade hanging out with little Amun-Her. Isn't that just great? Now, I'll let you decide for yourself if you think that George did the right thing in cremating the mummy and burying it under a cross, but because he did decide to bury the mummy in that particular manner, this story includes one last little bit of very interesting trivia. As this newspaper from 1967 points out, because Amun-Her died in 1883 BC, you might technically be able to say that he is the first human to ever be buried under a Christian cross. Technically. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.